Hello, welcome to the Conflict Authority Podcast. This is a podcast about conflict, what it is, how it gets started, and what you can do to evolve greater control over the conflicts in your life. My name is Leo. I am your host. In this episode, I will be discussing Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Chapter 6, Weak Points and Strong. In this chapter, Sun Tzu makes 4 main points. The first of these points is to get to your battlefield first, and that battlefield will be one that you have chosen if you've done everything correctly to this point, and you set up your camp and you wait for your enemy, for your opponent to show up. The idea behind this is that you're rested because you've already gotten to the battlefield, and they have to still get there, and as soon as they get there, they have to prepare themselves for battle. So, of course, this puts them, your opponent, at a disadvantage. In the context of conflict resolution, the analog to this is that you typically have to be the bigger person, the adult in the room, who is going to offer their apologies first and try to find a way to work the conflict out. In the context of conflict resolution, or in some cases even conflict management, that is how you get to the battleground first. Sun Tzu's next point is to control the battle. That means occupy an unassailable place. So the position you hold makes it even more difficult for your opponent to defeat you. You maximize your strengths. You keep your plans secret. You discover your opponent's plans and their vulnerabilities. You understand what's going on in the battle and you mix up your tactics. And you attack with great force against your opponent's weakest points. The analogs in a conflict resolution context for this advice are going to depend a lot on what's going on. Now, occupying an unassailable place might mean occupying the moral, ethical high ground and being very public about it, maximizing your strengths. I think that's going to hold true regardless of whether it's actual conflict or conflict resolution. Discovering your opponent's plans and vulnerabilities is just good advice in any situation. If you have an idea how they're going to approach you, it helps you, first of all, to counter whatever arguments that they might have, and maybe even come up with some kind of solution based on their weakest point, which is typically going to be what they're really worried about or what is really the problem for them. And that's not always going to be stated by your opponent. The next point, number 3, that Sun Tzu makes is to keep your opponent off balance. Now, he advises that you never let them catch their breath or regain their footing. You keep your opponent confused about what you're going to do. You threaten their vulnerabilities and force them to defend against those attacks. And you attack places that your opponent is obliged to defend. In the context of conflict resolution, keeping your opponent off balance may or may not be good advice. It's really going to be dependent on the opponent and the circumstances. And keeping your opponent off balance might anger them, which is something you really don't want if you're trying to resolve a conflict. Now, if you're trying to manage a conflict to outcomes that you desire, it might be helpful, but that's something you're going to have to figure out as you're navigating the conflict. And this leads us to Sun Tzu's final piece of advice in this chapter, which is fight the battle you are in and not the last battle that you won. And this kind of ties everything together what he's saying is make sure you're dealing with the circumstances of this particular conflict. Don't revert to strategies that might have won you a conflict in the past. Don't revert to thinking about your opponent in ways that you thought about opponents in the past. You have to deal with this opponent that's right here in front of you, and the tactics and strategies you use to navigate this conflict have to deal with this particular opponent. If you use the same tactics over and over and over, they might be good tactics, but unless your opponent is a fool, they might be able to get an idea of what you're going to be up to just because you keep using the same tactics and use that against you. And depending on what outcomes they're looking for, that might be good news or bad news. Again, it's all dependent on the conflict that you're in. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in hearing what happens next, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. If you have any concerns, comments, or complaints, or you just want to discuss something in particular, go ahead and hit me up on Twitter. My handle is @LeoArbar, Leorbar.